So, for those of you who don't know what AORA is a virtual platform that Benni and I co-founded and launched back in June 2020 with the aim of combining art, architecture, music, and more, with the hope of instilling a sense of calm, well-being, and discovery. At the heart of not only possibly creating opportunities for display for artists from all over the world, we're really, really passionate about community and creating opportunities and safe spaces for lateral conversations. So what does that mean? It's inviting a different artist or different thinkers, different creators from different disciplines every week to come around a conversation that we have been thinking about. And this is the very last conversation as part of AORA 3. So AORA 3 is the third exhibition that we've held on our virtual platform. And I could not think of a better topic for all of us to be engaging with other than art and society. Society not as, society in quotation marks, but really people. We are joined today by Jabulani, who is a photographer. He's based in South Africa. He's also an exhibitor in AORA 3. We're joined by Keshia Hannam, who's over in New York, who's a writer, a speaker, an activist, and Rosie Cooper, who is head of exhibitions at Warr Pavilion in the south of England. So that's a very, very brief overview from myself. Because we thought it would be much more interesting to have each of the various people we have with us today introduce themselves. So perhaps, Jabulani, we could start off with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're on mute.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jabulani Dhlamini, a South African-based photographer. And I mean, as a documentary photographer, I'm compelled to observe and to document what is happening around me. And my practice has always been about looking at human conditions and how the past is affecting the future. I like how Professor, one of the good writer, Prof. Korapets, when he says past, present, and future in one way, it's present. So my work looks at how the past affects the present, which is the future. Thank you.
Amazing. So here we have a little bit of your different works, right, that you've been working on over the past few years. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into photography. One thing that always drew me when I discovered your work originally is this idea of like documentary photography, actually capturing, different societies and their state of flux, and so on and so forth.
Yes. I mean, when I grew up as a cameraman. So I used to do weddings and parties, but that's my background. And what I liked about that is that has influenced me a lot, because of people would hire me to be photographed in how they wanted to be, how I wanted to be seen. And yes, but at that time, so I didn't know that photography could be career. And so I was like, so now while looking at that, I've seen that has a great influence, because of I use photography to start conversations around issues that are not easily, because of most of the time we as a community, it's not easy to start conversations on. I am mostly, I'm looking at what one of body of work that I did. It's recaptured in Sharpeville. It was one so my aunt, so Sharpeville, so it's documented. I've visited, after 40 years, I revisited Sharpeville. And in Sharpeville, what happens is that in 1960, so a lot of people here in South Africa during the apartheid times, people were asked, black people had to always have dome passes, like passports, so that our movement was controlled in a way. And on the 21st of March, Sharpeville people decided that they are tired of this. And it happened that, so they went to the nearest police station, and in that protesting, and in that process, I think 69 people died. So police fired them. And my aunt was one of those people who got injured. So she lost her leg. So she used to narrate her story. And because of when I was born, she was like that. So I thought, so it was very hard for me to comprehend this. You know, she'd always share her story of how she lost her legs. And I think after 40 years, you know, I decided to go back, you know, and in Sharpeville, because I studied at Valley University of Technology, which is not far from Sharpeville. And at that time, while I was still a student, the aim of the project was to, because of my way of working is collaborating with people that I'm photographing. So it's about two energies when they meet. So how I work is that I normally do the interviews, and I'll later interpret those visually, because I like the impact. I like the two energies when they meet. And so in Sharpeville, when I went, I was more interested. So I went, and the first time I did the portraits. But what I realized is that those portraits, it was only me. So it was mostly my contribution. So after 5 years, which was now I went back in 2012. I went back to redo the project. And this time I wanted even, you know, to collaborate even better. Hence, when you look at the images from Sharpeville, it's mostly the text, which brings my collaborator in, and also the visuals, which is part of me, that interpreting the energies or the interview. And so I've always worked. So my work has always been looking at this traumatic events, you know, but not only, mostly it's after effects, because I'm interested in how these have impacted the life of the community. And so I've always worked like that, you know. And in the images that you just projected now, they come from a project titled Isiseke, which is the foundation. And here the concept was, because I grew up in Soweto, and we have these houses that were built during the apartheid times, and we're still living those houses. And one of the things that I've questioned was that these houses were built in a certain concept. And so the role of this project was to question, is that role, why the houses were designed like this? Because it's 50 years, it's 27 years later, but we're still occupying the same houses. And these houses, obviously, they work like museums. They have captured our history. They have a lot of stories to tell. But they haven't changed. So I've looked into that also. So looking into Soweto uprising, you know. So most of my project, I'm more interested in the social issues that normally it's not easier to as a community to speak about. But I like collaborating. You know, it's mostly it's there's one thing that I like saying already. For me to use photography as an art medium, the role was one of the things that I wanted was to decolonize decolonize how photography was used in the apartheid times. You know, I wanted people to have a say. I wanted to collaborate. So people need to decide how they want to be seen, what stories they want to tell.
I think there's so much there that you said, Jabulani, and thank you for sharing that. I mean, the number one thing was, this element of communication. And, I think communication is so key, and communication, I know, runs through all of us, right now, in terms of it being a passionate element. I remember we were chatting on Monday, where we were sharing about language, right? And how this belief that art can be one of the most empathetic yet critical mediums by which you communicate about topics. And, here you're saying about social issues. And I think what drew me to your work, and it's interesting that you said that you revisit an issue afterwards and you collaborate, what impacted me was a sense of memory. It was a very tangible memory. You could feel the feeling in it. And that really, really resonates through your practice. And this idea of photography, having a decision of how you're going to be projected as a medium is really, really powerful. And I'm wondering that maybe we'll be coming back to the other works that have been included, but perhaps in terms of portrayal, it's quite interesting to maybe shift focus over to Rosie, the work that you have done in terms of, facilitating exhibitions, bringing together creators, communities, curating exhibitions, right? It's portrayal, right? But I wonder what, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Sure, thank you so much, Jen. And it was wonderful to hear you, Jabulani, as well. And it feels very fitting to just begin the few words that I have to say with this image, which is an image of the Warr Pavilion, which is another piece of architecture that contains a really particular story that I use to inspire much of my work and thinking. So this is the Warr Pavilion, and it's our institution. It was built as the People's Palace for Art and Culture, and it opened in 1935. And for me, it contains so much of what is relevant and urgent now still. So the idea of it being the People's Palace for Art and Culture, of course, that speaks to civic responsibility. It was also designed by a refugee called Erik Mendelsohn, who came to the UK fleeing Nazi Germany, and an emigre, Serge Shemaev, who came as a child from Chechnya in Russia. It's right on the very south coast of England, looking out tantalizingly towards Europe. And it will probably be, well, certain parts of the land around the pavilion are likely to be flooded or subject to flooding. Some people are predicting within 50 years. And its modernist structures are kind of battered by the wind and the kind of coastal erosion daily. So it's a really amazing place to think about open borders, about what is possible when we collaborate and when we work with, Erik Mendelsohn was fairly privileged as a refugee, but it's still incredibly important that I believe we keep our borders open to imagination and to perspectives and from others who are around us, from everybody, and to think about environmentalism as well, which is another really urgent issue. So if we go to the next slide, these are some of the principles that underpin the artistic program and the learning program that I've developed with colleagues since I've been there for over the last sort of 4.5 years. So the idea of depowering, dismantling institutional privilege, inclusion, the need to be mindful of what stories we tell and why. What does it mean when we have a platform? How can we use that to really interrogate our decisions and who we work with? Compassion, I believe that this is something that art can do. And Jabulani, it's really wonderful that you're part of this conversation, because I think that your work stems from this as well. This sense of increasing a sense of common humanity. And of course, collaboration is another thing that we share, responding to the needs of artists in our neighborhood. And the Warr Pavilion, which still has this kind of futuristic spaceship quality, despite being built almost 100 years ago now, being a kind of portal to possible futures and alternative pasts experienced in the present. So how can we keep these histories alive and active and meaningful, and not treat them as nostalgic objects or as calcified states? How can we remember that, that there isn't a sort of separation between the past and the present and the future? They're all overlapping all the time. And I think the building that that we occupy, the Warr Pavilion, really does that. And I just want to share the next slide, which is one of the I've just chosen a few projects that really hopefully reveal a little bit of the way in which I've been working through some of these urgencies and through some of the possibilities that the Warr Pavilion holds, and trying to create this kind of porous institution in which ideas and people flow in and out quite naturally, responding to the world around us. So this is a show where, of course, we work together, Jen, and where we met as well. Still I Rise, Feminism's Gender Resistance, which was a project that looked at gender-based resistance from an intersectional perspective. So looking not only at, feminism's gender resistance. So it was looking at the feminist struggle in relation to gender, class, race, really from the 19th century to now, and also speculating into the future, working with international artists from across the world. And then the next slide is Mikhail Korikis, which was a really beautiful moving image project that came out of a year-long residency that Mikhail Korikis, who's very interested in the possibilities of verbal and non-verbal communication and the politics of different forms of communication and speech. He worked for a year with Project Artworks, who are an organization dedicated to supporting and including artists who have complex support needs, who have physical disabilities, who are neurodiverse. So he made a series of portraits of them and their carers communicating with tenderness and with complexity, and looking at how to foreground different forms of language and what that can teach us about communicating with ourselves and one another. I just have a couple more slides, if that's okay, if I have enough time. So one of the things that we did, just thinking about what COVID has done, I guess, we closed our building for many months, more than once. We were suddenly faced, just thinking about the topic of tonight, which is art and society, we were faced with so many urgencies in our own organisation, but also with people around us in our neighbourhood, with the resurgence of action around Black Lives Matter globally. For example, the terrible situation that many individuals were in our neighbourhoods, the rise in food poverty, for example. So we rediverted some of the funding that we had to spend some time listening to those around us who are engaged in social justice work. And Jen, you came to one of the events that we did at the weekend, working with people in our neighbourhood, including the Refugee Buddy Project, Transition Town, who are an environmental-based group, and Maria Nabire, who's an artist also engaged in justice work. So thinking about how we making a series of events that highlighted to broad publics the issues they were dealing with on a daily basis, and also trying to find ways in which our institution could support that work better and in the long term. Not just a series of conversations, but more in the long term. And we also have an exhibition opening just in a couple of weeks now, oh my God, which also highlights some of the work that one of the organizations was engaged with over the last year, which is to create this series of patchwork quilts that told a kind of people's history of the pandemic. So we had a gap in our program. We had this local organization engaged in this work, activist organization, and we decided to use that gap to present their work, to welcome them back and to share this people's history of a pandemic. And I also just wanted to mention one further exhibition we have coming up in the autumn, which is Rock Against Racism, Militant Entertainment 1976 to 82, which tells the story of a major cultural movement in the late 1970s in the UK, and asks what we can do now to respond to issues. How can we use culture to tackle racism and inequality more generally? And there's a great commission by Larry Achiampong. So I'm really sorry. I'm sure I've gone way over my time.
No,
but
you're great.
there's so much to say. And thank you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
No, amazing. Thank you so much, Rosie, for all of that. It's super inspiring, super interesting. And also, I think for people who are listening, you know, when you think of an institution or a place, you know, where you can display, that's not where it starts and where it ends, right? There's all these different elements of engagement and the people, and what are the narratives, the stories that you are telling, the ones that you're profiling, the people that you're bringing on board and together in order to tell those stories. And I loved, you know, how you were drawing those associations with Jabulani's work in terms of collaboration, compassion. Compassion is a very strong word. And I think that, you know, I was maybe hinting that beforehand, thinking about empathy. And this is something that Benni and I have been thinking a lot about in the context of AORA, through the language and who is included, who's displayed, how it's done, how we come together. So no, thank you so much for all of that. So maybe this is a wonderful, you know, it is a wonderful moment to introduce Keshia.
Thank you, darling. And Rosie, I don't think you ever need to apologize for explaining the beautiful work that you do. What else are you doing? Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here. Jen, can you just give me a little preview of some of my slides just so I can decide which direction to take it? Maybe just do a quick, like 1, 2, 3, 4. Awesome. Okay, beautiful. Great. So I am Keshia. I am currently in New York, in Brooklyn, which to acknowledge the original custodians of this land is Lenape land. Originally from Hong Kong. My mother is Indian. My father is English, but by Australia, I went to school in Australia. So like my background, I've sort of given up trying to explain where I'm from and what I do. There has been always a difficulty for me in explaining that one thing because I've always been so interested and passionate about multiple things. So I would prefer to tell you a story. I apologize, there's some road works happening outside. So at that point, I'd been living in Australia for 2 years. And I remember being in India. Oh, my internet connection's unstable. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Okay.
Yeah.
I think you lost me for a second. And I remember being in India, in Bombay. My family are in Bombay now, and please pray for India. They are really enduring horrible, horrible suffering. And being so confused about why there's a beach called Manori that has been the sort of holiday destination of my family for many generations. And standing on that beach and wondering why the beach here looks so different to the beach in Australia. And that for me is the inception of a curiosity, I guess, to use a euphemism, or sort of an incomprehension of inequality and how it manifests. And so from there, I guess that is what has come to be the anchoring of many of the foci of my project, which are sort of anchored in belonging and bias, which is where I have sort of identified a lot of human suffering is found in, and something that I think we need to speak more openly about to be able to acknowledge and then start to rectify it. So after that experience, I would move to Australia, study sociology, international business, and journalism, and then start to travel and live in as many countries as possible to try and understand more of just different perspectives. I ended up moving to Hong Kong and becoming a journalist, and then got into community building because it was in these travels that I started understanding that change happens in community. And it happens when you can look into somebody else's eyes and see change for them and believe that maybe that's possible for yourself. And so when we're talking about activism and society at large, how do we make change? I believe that part of that is a community piece. And so from there, you know, that turned into too many different projects. And I suppose that now what I could do is sort of put into 4 boxes of cultural and social activism consulting, speaking, which is what's on screen right now. This was from a panel during London Fashion Week in February of 2020, just before we went shut down in London, around bias in the fashion industry and how we can correct it, to climate and the impending climate crisis that will affect everyone, particularly Black and Brown communities, and how bias has caused us to get to that place, and then writing and communication, I guess. To speak a little bit to some of the photos that we have up there, Jen, you can probably slide through the first 2 or 3. This is speaking New York, doing a lot of kind of education-based talks around bias with schools, with universities, with various organizations. A lot of corporates came to me in the wake of the public murder of George Floyd last year, recognizing the need to address our bias in a very, very tangible and structural way. And so a lot of my work became around working with different corporations. But then the sort of slide I'd like to get to is the one of the Zoom calls, if we can. I think it's the next one. Oh wait, we'll go back and do one here. So 2 behind where I'm standing beside. This is on the left. We have a photographer who's based out of the Ivory Coast. And during the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, I worked with an organization called Dear World, which is where I do a lot of my speaking. But we have a foundation, and I organized a grant scheme that gave micro grants to photographers around the world, because obviously the photography industry and the film industry was one of the hardest hit by COVID. And there's a very powerful series, if you go to stories.dearworld.org, where photographers told the story of their COVID experience in their hometown. So that was one of the initiatives. And on the right-hand side is a very talented artist. You would call her creative. She's a director, creative director, filmmaker, photographer, Mahanila. This is her exhibit that opened during the pandemic in partnership with Maison Sassoon. And she is actually featured in an upcoming article that I have coming out with Vogue India about the South Asian women who are shaping the music scene of New York City. Next slide. And this was a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last year, as I'm sure that everyone has and can relate to. A lot of Zooms, a lot of writing, but specifically the work that one of the projects that I'm proudest of, and something I would be very curious to dive into in terms of art and society, is the concept of echo chambers. And I do some production and creative consulting with Ailey Golding, the singer and songwriter. And we produced a series called Pass the Mic for her. And that was a very intentional move after Mr. Floyd's murder, because we recognized that clearly we have been speaking into echo chambers. If there was such a drastic and overwhelming response to that murder, and as shocking as it was to many people, it wasn't shocking at all. And so we started this series where we would pair Ellie with different, she has a following, for those of you who don't know her, she has a following of over 15 million across different platforms, and would partner her with different activists, as large as Vice President Al Gore and Patrisse Cullors, who is the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, to people on the ground like Citizen UK, who handle homelessness in London, to the Global Citizen, who are responsible for advocating on behalf of the 200 plus Latin American activists that are killed for environmental reasons every year. And so a lot of the work that I do is now around how can we bring disparate people together to listen to each other, which is a very full circle moment of building communities around the world and recognizing that change that happens, it happens when you can see it in somebody else, and it also happens when we can allow for dialogue and discomfort, I guess we could call it, where there is meant to be a certain amount of discomfort because it means that we're learning something. And how do we teach people to hold more resilience, and how do we expose people to things that their digital and life algorithms might not expose them to ordinarily. So I think I'll pause there. Otherwise, I feel we will run out of discussion time. But yeah.
No, thank you so much, Keshia. That was really, 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 really interesting, and describing your personal journey and all the way to what you're doing now. And I think there's certain elements, that one of categorization, or like, you know, where are you from, what do you do, there are all these pigeonholings, which, you know, I hope that through exactly what you're describing, you know, dialogue and discomfort, which I think is a very, very beautiful way to summarize it, and very meaningful one, and one that I'll be thinking about, you know, in order to assess, you know, these different chambers that I think that we've created over time, and, you know, to think about if we're in one, or we most probably are, you know, an echo chamber. Just on that point, you know, and I always think it's interesting what you're saying about algorithms. You know, the current exhibition at AORA that's ending this week, it was thinking about bodies in an expansive sense. And as soon as you enter the space, the first hall was thinking about structures. So these are the structures that society creates. And on the one hand, they can connect people, you know, such as language, right? It can help me to communicate with you, right, through English right now, but it can also create distancing, right? Or it can create isolation. So it's like observing these different structures that have been created and really having a conversation with them, and about them. So I think this places us in a really interesting place to open up the question to each one of you, which is, you know, what does this big topic, you know, art and society, what does it mean to you, right? And I kind of want to come back to you, Jabulani, and, you know, I'm going to rest on one of your projects, and maybe you could tell us, you know, what does art and society mean to you when you hear that title?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, while I was preparing for this talk, I mean, I thought about this, and I mean, the easy term for me was art and community, because for me, it you know, it has been my practice. It has always been my practice. Like I've said, I grew up as a cameraman, you know, as a street photographer, making weddings. And one thing that I've realized is that communities has a story to tell, and I in a way collaborate with the community. So I also have a story to tell, but in a way I'm collaborating with the community. For instance, the image that you were looking at, it was taken in 2015 and in Sharpeville, you know, and like I said, I mean, the community have always felt the sense of talking about their stories. So when I went, I studied at the UT, when I went to Sharpeville, the community of Sharpeville have always wanted to talk about their stories in their own way. Obviously, the story of Sharpeville has been kept, people have been working in Sharpeville, but people have felt that they've never done it because of language also matters, you know, and they've never done it in their home languages and to express themselves, what they wanted to say, you know. And so for me, this brought that, or this, for me, my art or my practice can't exist without community. And because of it mirrors what community want to say. And because I'm also part of that community, you know. And so I would say, so my work has always been about that, you know, art in the community. And also because of that, also I've also went inside the houses of the survivors and like doing interiors. And what attracted, you know, what I was interested in, I was more interested in how people are trying to tell their own stories, how they're curating their own houses, in shaping the story, which stories are important in their lives. And, you know, so I was interested in that, in collaborating with them and telling the story. So for me, this means that, you know, in my practice especially, these two exist, you know. Without one, for me, in my practice, one can't exist.
I think a very first, you know, terminological question that you've just picked up on, which is just so valuable, is this niggling point or niggling question of like society, and is it, you know, thinking about community instead. There's something about rephrasing it as community that has this sense of warmth, this sense of like expansiveness, but also intimacy, right?
Sure.
Which I think is just so, so important. And another thing that really struck me, what you were saying, it was you're capturing people, and you've got your own story, but they've got their own story. And it kind of reminds you that, you know, here, okay, we're having a conversation via Zoom, you're using technology, or you're using an apparatus, but people are at the heart of everything. You know, and, you know, whether that be, you know, in terms of you creating it or depicting, I think that's really powerful.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, because of one of the things is mostly I'm attracted to these traumatic events, and the aim is not to, I mean, maybe make this to relieve, but it's to critique, you know, because of bodily so, I mean, give opportunity to people to reflect, because of what I've realized is that, you know, people have lived under certain, you know, certain conditions in such a way that they've accepted. And so, but in using photography to question this, to give people a chance to think about, is this the right thing? That's what's happening. So it's mostly to bring it so that we can criticize this and learn it from it. You know, hence I've said it's more of the past, future, and present. You know, so we need to learn from our past. And as we know, in South Africa, we don't have that good past. You know, but what do we do with that past that we have, you know? And also the question in my work, questions like, how do you liberate someone's mind, you know, like that has been oppressed for more than 20 years because of they've come to live this has become, you know, what, you know, living under oppression has become their lifestyle. Even after 27 years of democracy, they still have that in, you know, so it's more of, as an artist, it's more of, let's not documenting this so that we bring it to so that we can communicate, so that we can start conversations about this and talk and see that, you know, learn from our past in proposing the future.
Incredible. And I think you really just outlined it there, you know, like the past looking towards the future, but also what you're talking about. I think what you're saying, like the critique, you know, Keshia, I'm thinking about what you were saying about, you know, dialogue and discomfort. You know, when you're critiquing something, it's not comfortable. You know, it's addressing real things that have happened and posing real questions of how do we build, and what do we build next? And I wonder, Keshia, whether, I don't know, anything of those things like resonate, and also, you know, I guess, you know, this question now of like, what does art and society mean to you?
I love that. Yeah, so many interesting thoughts, Jabulani, from your comments, and even in your initial introduction, something that struck with me that you said was decolonizing, essentially image making, and the way that is represented. And for me, that has been a personally very relatable journey in terms of being a mixed heritage immigrant in every situation that I am in, and recognizing that my proclivity to adapt to this scenario as a survival mechanism meant that there was sort of confusion around identity and how to think. And I think that there is an interesting moment that we are in, because to talk about decolonizing, we can't think about society without recognizing that we live within certain structures like patriarchy, like capitalism, and like colonialism that has come from that follows that we have a sort of overemphasis on European intellectualism and what that has meant for cultures that are not European. And I guess, you know, talking about discomfort, it's a very uncomfortable thing. And I think that it's a deep-seated human fear that we now have of recognizing that not only do we need to change structures and representation, but we all need to look inward at what we have imbibed and how we need to change as people on a neurological level. And Jabulani, and also, you know, Rosie, I'm sure that you could speak to this as well with the work that you do with your artists, featuring so many, particularly refugees and immigrants. What is the practical way that we start to do that in a way that makes it accessible to people without pandering. You know, like there's a beautiful movement in the US that I've seen of many Black photographers featuring and centering Black joy as a protest movement in terms of how Black people have been portrayed in the US. And I wonder if there are similar functions, I guess, or tools that can be used to still address the problem and challenge it, because it needs to be challenged, and we have to all recognize that will require resilience and a lot of discomfort, but also making it progressive so that we don't stay talking about it, but we actually act on it and you know, represent it in different ways. Maybe Jabulani, you can speak to it first, and then I would love to hear from Rosie.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. Is that one of the into that suggests it's more, you know, with my practice, it's always been looking at that exactly what you're questioning. It's how do we bring, because of some of the issues that I get to look at, they bring that discomfort, but at the same time it's more, hence I go to people's spaces and just to, because I believe if we can just start talking about, you know, like one of the important things that I've realized is that a lot of people things have happened in their lives, so but they didn't have a chance to speak about. And which one, talking about something that's so the aim of this bodies of work is to create that safe space for us to have safe conversations, you know, and that I believe it more we easily suggest or bring solutions, you know, because of no one is being attacked, no one is being, but it's more of, this is a safe space to communicate, to talk about issues that are affecting us. I don't know if I answered.
No, yeah, absolutely.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think, you know, what I'm getting out of that, you know, thinking about when you're thinking about art and society, and, you know, for those who necessarily can't, like, you know, I'm saying society in quotation marks, right? Maybe it can also be a prompt for action, right? A prompt for also, you know, making changes. Sounds too lofty, but I think, you know, having these different dialogues in order to, you know, initiate maybe a different reframing or a different set of, you know, algorithms, or just like, you know, that I think that neurological aspect is really important. I wonder whether, Rosie, you have any comments, you know, thinking about, you know, art and society, what comes to mind, speaking of neurological points, what comes to mind when you hear, you know, that title?
Sure, and thanks so much, Jabulani and Keshia, for speaking so eloquently on the subject as well. There's so much in both of what you're saying that I really, really resonate with. So what comes to my mind, first of all, is that the phrase art and society creates a kind of false binary, because it sees them as separate, whereas it's impossible for them to be separate, because art and artists and what art is about and where art comes from, everything, it's absolutely in society, and it's in community, as you were saying, Jabulani, and it's completely interwoven and intertangled, or entangled. And I think I want to also just talk a little bit to the structures that Keshia was mentioning. And of course, we need to really recognize that what we are or what we do is existing within a patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist structures. And I believe now that the next phase needs to be that we need to try not to replicate that. And as arts institutions and artists, you know, I believe very strongly that cultural institutions and cultural spaces, which are, you know, essentially, even though in reality, it's way more complicated than that. They're public spaces. We are publicly funded. Our institution is publicly funded. Yes, there's many, many barriers to inclusion, but we're essentially public spaces, and we're some of the few public spaces that are left for the freewheeling imagination. And that is what we need to build towards possible futures. I also believe that if we were to make cultural institutions from scratch now, they probably wouldn't look anything like the Warr Pavilion. They'd maybe be more within communities. Maybe some of them would be in doctors' surgeries. Maybe some of them would be in schools, or, you know, they could be dispersed in many different places. And of course, there's ways to address that dispersal, but I think that what we need to recognize is that the kind of hierarchies, the staffing structures, even the job titles, the pay structures, including how we pay artists, all replicates the structures of oppression that we're living under. And I think we have the possibility to harness the extraordinary collective imagination that we have amongst us with working with artists and with other cultural thinkers to totally remodel our cultural institutions. I think it's going to take a long time, and I personally get really impatient sometimes because I want it to happen overnight. It's not going to, but I think we need to make a move to make this happen. I'm interested in different models of employing artists, for example. I'm also interested in the possibility of employing activists on the team. What would it look like to employ community organizers? Can we just look really different? You know, what are the boards that we need? How can we support people to be on boards that are more inclusive? I don't have any professional training as a curator at all. I'm also not a trained art historian. It is possible to enter the institution in different routes. That seems to have, those possibilities have shrunk since I've entered my professional life, really, you know, over the last 10 years, I think. And I think we need to find ways to reopen those channels again. And I do think that we have the brains and the imagination amongst us in the arts to make that happen, but we can't lose the momentum. I think some of that momentum was built within society at large, and I think we need to try and find a way of keeping it going. And I find these kinds of conversations really heartening when we come together in a room as artists and activists and cultural organizers and try and sort of, even for a brief period of time, share some of the ideas and thinking that are inspiring us to try and make those changes.
Can I just add something to that? Sorry, sorry. Well, very, very quickly, and it's part comment, part question. But I've always been fascinated by Scandinavia, because you find that, you know, you see children there. I've got friends at Scandinavia, and they have design art, you know, in them, and it's obviously something that they must have, you know, training or education from a very young age. And I think everything that we're talking about is this idea of community and communication. How do you convey the power of art to society? And I come across this in architecture as well. How do you engage with communities? So, I mean, I know there's lots been talked about, but I wonder if there's any ways that you found of being able to engage with communities so that they can, you know, see the value of what you're offering. That's just an open question. Keshia, you were going to say something. I wonder if you could answer that.
Well, it was almost to that point. So we did a mind share for a second. I think that it's interesting to talk about community engagement. I think it also speaks a lot to the nature of representation and how things will look like the people who have made them. And so, number one, it has to be such an intentional thing that we have aesthetic diversity, but not just that, obviously incorporating those ideologies. I think it's interesting to think about how the pandemic has affected. I host a podcast around the future of work and how this sort of decentralized version of the modern workforce, so this is not for everybody, but for many of us in the West, our lives were changed in such a way that we were able to work remotely. And how useful that is in some ways, but also how much of a slap of the face it is to many in the disabled community who have been asking for this kind of access for decades, and we're told, no, it's too difficult, we couldn't, this is, you know, and then, you know, within 6 weeks, everyone was like, I'd like you to see my digital strategy and for remote work and presentations. And just how possible it is for us to do this, it just requires that discomfort. It just requires so much work. It's effortful and it's costly. And so, you know, keeping in mind that so much of this ideology shift comes from going to people from specific communities and not just asking their opinion and then going back to our mostly homogenous groups and executing on that, but actually integrating into the fold, into the DNA, into the cornerstone, people from different communities, so that sort of representation and the subsequent actions that can come from that is unavoidable, you know? And obviously that's an oversimplification, but I think that we have often consulted communities versus integrating them, and that's something that needs to be changed.
Completely, I agree. Consultation versus integration. That is, you know, it was interesting. I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend, and it was the distinction between learning something and understanding. You know, so you can learn something and then you can understand it. So in the same way, it's this kind of surface level as opposed to something that is actually ingrained. And, you know, there are several points, you know, that were made. And it's funny because I had, you know, a list of questions in my head that I wanted to ask you, but you kind of preempted it, you know, and this idea of like art and society, you know, that's a tricky question. Why is it and? Why is it has to be, it's in, it's with, it's of, right? All these different other operative terms, because intrinsically, you know, it's something that's created, that's manifested. And, you know, I think also coming from a very strict visual arts background, I also think there's a lot of ridiculous structures and hierarchies there in terms of, you know, what can enter that canon, what can not. Right. And I think this is something that also needs to be revisited. And we're thinking about structures. And this is why, you know, I think it's really interesting, Jabulani, to hear about your background. You know, you were saying that you were a cameraman, or right, or even Rosie, you know, you're sharing the fact that, you know, you're not an art historian or you're not a curator. So, you know, also rethinking that, even that little tricky term, art, right? And being aware and conscious of all the biases that are associated with it in terms of that structure. I guess another, I mean, you know, you touched briefly in terms of, you know, the last year, right? You know, Keshia, we saw, you know, it was on that Zoom call, or, you know, Rosie was sharing how your programming, you know, has been postponed, but also how it's shifted, and it's deliberately shifted. And, you know, there was a mention of how perhaps the last year has been difficult for like photography and maybe access to different communities and so on and so forth. I'd be interested to hear, you know, with all these different thought processes of what art in, with, for society is, you know, how has that shifted and moved and changed, you know, for you over the course perhaps of, you know, it doesn't even have to be the last year of the pandemic, and can be, you know, over a period of phase of your life. You know, Rosie, you mentioned the last 10 years. Perhaps I throw that over to Keshia first.
I probably have a very unsophisticated perception of this, because I've never been in the art world. I've been very blessed to have friends like Jenn and Charlie, who's in this call, who have been. But I see art, and if you were to ask me what art means, for me, it means the documenting and expressing of the human condition and navigating the world. And so I think that art has almost been, you know, it's been commodified to such a point that it's sort of lost a lot of its not even true meaning, just true potential for impact. However, artists have always paved the way for the next era. And so I think that the point I was going to make about the last year and how we've sort of restructured and rethought about what a lot of concepts and rituals and protocols are. Like, I don't know if any of you observed this, but I was watching the Oscars with my partner the other night, and I found it really weird when people kind of got on stage and did almost this perfunctory, you know, ode to X social cause. Sometimes it was very meaningful and it had huge impact, but a lot of the time it felt very uncomfortable given the environment that it was sort of set in. Not to say that I don't love the Academy Awards and think that they have a place, and I think awarding talent is incredibly necessary, and making the shift and the pendulum swinging and all those things. But I guess that we were almost put into this time capsule where the planet and society was kind of told to go and sit down and think about what you've done. And now everyone's coming back into the world and being like, why do we do things like that? And so I don't have much of a solution or a conclusion as much as a musing about how our reaction to that, and how much we continue to just conform to what it is and how it exists, versus sitting with, again, discomfort and sitting with things that don't feel comfortable, sitting with racism should never have felt comfortable. There's an incredible article, essay by Martin Luther King called around maladjustment, essentially, and how he refused to adjust. He said, I will always be maladjusted, because why would I adjust to some of these social conditions? And so I wonder how we will carry our own maladjustment back into this world after a break of 14 months, and what we will choose to tolerate and be intolerant of.
Yeah, I think that visual of, the pendulum and realizing what you've been tolerant of and just asking how and not. It's very, very visual, but also very physical. I can actually, right before we were starting this call, we were having a little chat, about, our weeks, and I'm sure everyone here has been feeling the same. It's like this, just so much is going on, and it's just like, well, why? No way, I don't want to do that little race the way exactly I was doing it before. No, why? No. Like, let's think about it differently. Sorry, I'm being bombarded by news. But perhaps Rosie, perhaps you could share with us a little bit what it's been for you over the last year. And I really want to say to everyone that's on this call, this is once again, as I said at the start, like a safe space, intimate space. I would love to hear from all of you, but even at least a couple of you, if you have any questions, whatsoever. I see, like Charlie and Helen. Also, it'd be interesting to hear what you've been thinking. So thank you. Over to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been, I mean, as I spoke to before, it's been a moment where the inequalities that have always been there have been revealed in a new way. Well, not a new way, in fact, they've just been revealed to many more than perhaps were aware of how deep they went and how violent they truly are. And it's also been a moment where new inequalities have been created as well, and these urgencies are real. And I think there's been this kind of fight or flight state that we've been in, and I have been really interested in conversations with friends, colleagues, family members, in who has been responding through, when you have this great moment of uncertainty. I think many people have wanted to face right into that and face right into what that's meant, and take on the discomfort and actually think, okay, how can we use this incredible uncertainty as a place to make change from? But I've also been, and I'm one of those people, but I've also been, unsurprised but alarmed at how people are striving towards the old way again, and who just want to get as far away from how those inequalities look to them as possible, and get away from the discomfort and stop engaging with it. And I feel that that's really scary for me, because I do think there's an opportunity for shift. Some things inevitably are going to shift, but we do have this opportunity for change. And I just feel, I'm a natural optimist, fortunately, but I'm just wanting to know what's going to happen next. I'm sitting here in hope that in another year's time, or in 2 years, 3 years, we will really see that change that we want to see, and that we'll be motivated by we will stop being motivated by fear.
I fully agree with what Rosie, what you have shared. I mean, because of I mean, it has been hard, like since the lockdown was announced here in South Africa. One of the things that there's a current body of work that I'm working on, but that it has highlighted most of a lot of the problems that we inherited from the apartheid times, the inequality, they were highlighted during during this time. I mean, I was working on I'm currently working on this project, looking at the impact, because I felt also that as a community we had to learn from this, and obviously proposing that this give us a way to propose a change. It becomes an easier way for us to move where we are, not to go back, but to go forward, to come with solutions. Because of a lot of and while I was doing this, while I was working on this, like what I've realized, a lot of people, in terms of unemployment rate, it has affected them directly. A lot of people, when I went around, because of what also the role of the project that I was doing was also to give voices to those people, and even though I had to maybe change how I worked, so I worked from the car just to keeping the distance, but I felt that the role of photography or of art needed not to stop with what was happening, so I felt that I had to give people a chance to express their feelings on what is happening. So a lot of people, I mean, they would share their stories of in the result, what I saw is that a lot of inequalities, they were exposed. A lot of people that were not coping. Those people who were affected from the old apartheid times.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that links in quite well with one of the questions that has been put forward into the chat, which is, can art help us build back better? And if so, how? And already what you're showing, Jabulani, is, already this conversation. It's this opportunity to share, to exchange, to display. I wonder if anyone else wanted to add anything, to that. Rosie.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to just question the phrase "build back better," because that's a phrase that comes from our government, the Conservative government, who have been routinely not supporting those who are at greatest need. And I think that phrase "build back better" is also motivated by, exactly, and is also motivated by economic thinking. And whilst it's incredibly important to build back the economy, I think we need to think about how we can support and respond to communities and include artists. Okay, right, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Just in response to your comment that Keshia just made about a quote from the Biden administration.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. Wow.
No, I've just heard it from our Conservative government. But I think we need to move to this. The event that we did on Sunday, Jen, as part of this care and citizenship program that we're doing, some of it has been very international. Some of the one that you came to, Jen, was very, very localized, and it was really listening to and responding to and having a very direct conversation with some of the kind of grassroots organizers, activists. Exactly, really. Exactly. Who were around us. And I think that we're still figuring out with them, with the people who are closest to some of those inequalities and urgencies. I also think that again, like Jabulani, as you were saying, that art in conversation with community, so not putting it all on art, but putting it on the understanding that we have infrastructures, we have conversations, we have relationships, we are individuals, our institutions are made up of a group of individuals who are also citizens. Like, how can we mobilize? How can we also support artists who are also experiencing food poverty, for example, and struggling to find a way of living? You know, how can we do this? But also, how can we use our platforms to advocate? I think that's really important as well. So we're sharing what needs to be done as much as possible. Not a straightforward answer, sorry, because I'm not sure if we have it yet.
No, yeah, but I think that's yeah, I think that's really, really important. God, I sound so facile, but I mean, it is. And you know, I was laughing there with Build Back Really Better and actually doing that. And I also, I mean, I think this sense of better, you know, always striving for something higher, I also think in itself is a little bit tricky. You know, and there's so much with what you have right now and how to actually help all of that grow. Anyway, we're not going down that route. I want to actually flag another question. Helen, thank you so much. So Helen has written, I mean, Helen, wonderful collaborator, dear friend, also a head of curatorial program over at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and has written, you know, thank you so much for a brilliant conversation. Something I'm wrestling with is how to inclusively bring people who feel afraid of change on the journey.
I'll have a go. Obviously case by case, but I think that what's really interesting is that we talk a lot, particularly in capitalism, because what we value must be output driven and tangible. And so much of what we are reckoning with is emotional. And we don't have the words for it because, again, a lot of the language that we have were written largely by men. And the nature of masculinity being, again, less emotional. I'm obviously speaking in very masculine, feminine terms that are oversimplified. But the idea that we don't necessarily have a lot of the words to articulate what people are experiencing. And so when we say people are afraid of change on the journey, I think a lot of what this requires, and I really like this question because I think it points back to the responsibility that we all have to just be humans first and foremost, and to sit, yes, and to think about organizational change, and yes, to vote and be active citizens, but also to be, you know, brothers and spouses and mothers and best friends and whomever else, and understand why a person is concerned about the change. And a lot of it is an emotional fear. You know, if we think about what we could do structurally, a lot of change would happen if we just had more people, particularly Black and brown people, represented. That would change a lot of our society structure. It would change the flow of funds. It would change the way that stories are told. There are a lot of just practical changes that would happen. Why doesn't that happen? Well, it's the same conversation as we've been having around gender for a long time. Is it requires power sharing, and people are scared to power share. At the end of the day, there is a fear, whether acknowledged or not, that I will lose something. And the losing of something feels like persecution, and persecution feels like something you need to defend against. And defense comes in the form of a variety of different emotions. One of them being anger, another of them being fear, another of them being avoidance, another of them being combative. You know, there's so many different results of that. And so I guess the long answer to that is, for me, what I have found very effective, both on an organizational level, a more macro level, and a micro level in terms of individual conversations, is understanding what the fear is.
Yeah.
Which bit of change are you afraid of, and why is it? Is it because you think you're going to lose something? What do you know, if you keep asking questions, you'll kind of get to a point where either there is no further intellectual response and it requires further emotional introspection, or I think that you unveil what the problem is, and it requires, you know, it still requires emotional introspection, but it sort of highlights the specificity of the blockage. And I think that's something that we just don't speak enough about, because we are fearful of emotions because they don't generate GDP.
That's really a brilliant response. And I think, you know, it comes, fear can lead to so much different type of paralysis. And I think that leaning in with curiosity is just great practical advice, whether that be in the context of, you know, art, rebuilding, even just on like personal anything, like, so that macro level. I mean, one thing that I think about a lot is with curiosity, and actually to use one of your words again, Rosie, which is compassion. So curiosity and compassion, and being like, okay, your fear is real to you, and okay, but I'm going to communicate with you about it in this way. I'm conscious that it is now 7:15, and that we've had, you know, 15 minutes extra than otherwise originally planned for. But, you know, I think leaving with that thought of curiosity, that thought of compassion, that thought of how art, you know, to use that wide sense of the term, is something that I think can be channeled in a way to open up different conversations. Those conversations don't have to be easy, they can be difficult, but that doesn't make them any less meaningful, actually on the contrary. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I could not actually think of a more thought-provoking exchange to put, you know, brackets on this chapter of AORA that was thinking about bodies. So I appreciate you all, and, you know, thank you for your time, Jabulani, Keshia, Rosie, and everyone who's been a part of this journey so far and who's joined us here today. So thank you. And, you know, please stay tuned for our next exhibition. It'll be launching in June, and it's going to be exploring urbanism. So once again, in an expansive manner, but thinking about actually people and communities and how those have evolved and shifted in the fabrics of them throughout the course of time, and obviously in the last year. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for joining, everybody. Thank you, Benny.
Thank you.
Jen.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.